Okay, in this chapter, we're going to consider the ethical issues surrounding a practice called euthanasia. Euthanasia involves ending a person's life for that person's own sake to prevent them from some form of suffering. So imagine like a 90-year-old cancer patient dying of pancreatic cancer, and the doctor gives them a prognosis of, just like a few more months. But the doctor says these are going to be months of excruciating suffering. So on the one hand, the patient could live out the rest of their life and just suffer when there's really no hope for them. On the other hand, they could end their life. There are various ways to do this, using drugs, end their life painlessly, and that just eliminates the possibility that they suffer. Right. So if we know there's a high likelihood they're going to suffer, why would it make sense for them to just kind of live out the rest of their life and suffer? All right. So euthanasia would involve taking their life. There are different kinds of euthanasia. We're going to draw a few distinctions between different kinds of euthanasia. The issue of consent is very important when it comes to euthanasia. And so we're just going to be thinking about some of the ethical arguments that come up in this debate in this chapter. All right, so there's a definition of euthanasia for you on this slide. We're going to be thinking mostly about voluntary cases of euthanasia in this chapter. So that's a case where the person does give their consent to being euthanized. There are a few ways to do this. One way to give consent is to just verbally tell a doctor, I would like you to end my life in peace, like a death with dignity. Another way to do it is to fill out a legal document that's called an advance directive. So sometimes patients know that at some future time they're going to be unable to communicate with their doctor. They're going to be unresponsive. Maybe they know they're going to be in a state of coma or something like that. And so they can fill out this advance directive document that tells the doctor what to do should the patient be incapacitated to the point where they can't communicate with the doctor anymore. That's another way of giving consent, is by filling out an advance directive. Maybe some of you have heard of, DNRs, do not resuscitate. That's a message to the doctor, do not resuscitate me. That's another kind of way of giving consent to allow the doctor to just let you die. All right. So euthanasia is voluntary, just in case the patient requesting to be euthanized is giving their consent. Other kinds of euthanasia are non-voluntary and involuntary. So non-voluntary involves euthanizing a patient who can't make the decision for themselves. So imagine somebody like, a newborn baby or a very small child who can't yet communicate, or maybe somebody in a persistent vegetative state or in a coma where they can't express their wishes. In these cases, it's typical for the doctor to have a conversation with the family members of the patient and try and make a decision that would respect the wishes of the family. Also taking into consideration the potential prospects for this patient. Like, is it likely that they're going to come out of this vegetative state? Is there a possible cure for this newborn who has a certain disease? Nevertheless, if euthanasia is performed on people who can't decide for themselves, that's non-voluntary euthanasia. That's an ethically interesting category because it doesn't involve consent by the patient, but of course the patient isn't able to give their consent anyways, so somebody else has to make the decision, right? Necessarily has to make the decision. All right, involuntary euthanasia is a kind of euthanasia that we're going to set aside. We're not going to think about whether this is okay or not, because since it doesn't involve consent and the people that would be euthanized in a case of involuntary euthanasia are capable of giving their consent, it seems something quite obviously morally problematic about that kind of euthanasia. So imagine somebody saying like, yeah, I realize I have cancer, but I don't want to be euthanized, and then the doctor euthanizes them anyways, that would go against the patient's wishes, and that obviously seems morally problematic. So in this chapter, we're going to be thinking about cases of euthanasia that are voluntary, where the patient does give consent, and also cases where the patient is unable to express their wishes. So those are the non-voluntary cases. What's the ethical status of euthanasia in those cases? Is it morally permissible? Is it ever morally wrong? Um, that's what we're going to be thinking about. I'm sure all of you are already familiar with one kind of euthanasia called passive euthanasia, which just involves withholding treatment for a patient, turning off a ventilator, turning off some other form of life support. At the end of a patient's life, suppose somebody is dying and they're on a ventilator, and they say, pull the plug to the doctor. Then the doctor pulls the plug. A few hours later, the patient passes away. That's a case of passive euthanasia. And it's typical to think that this is okay. Like most people in the United States, for instance, think that passive euthanasia is not the sort of thing that raises any moral issue. It's legal in all 50 US states. It doesn't involve killing a person. What kills the person in a case of passive euthanasia is whatever is causing their disease or ailment. Right? So it doesn't involve killing anybody. Active euthanasia, on the other hand, is very controversial. Active euthanasia is illegal in all 50 US states. It involves taking a direct action to cause somebody's death. So this is legal in some other parts of the world, in some of the Scandinavian countries, in the Netherlands, for instance, Denmark. A patient can request to be actively euthanized. And what that involves is something like a doctor injecting a patient with a certain kind of drug that will put them to sleep and end their life. Right? So that's active euthanasia. It's different from passive euthanasia only in the sense that it involves directly causing somebody's death in the active case, whereas in the passive case, the doctor is just withholding the necessary life support that keeps the patient alive. The third category on this slide is physician-assisted suicide, which is legal in about a dozen US states now. It involves the doctor helping the patient to take their own life. So the difference between active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide is the doctor causes the patient's death in active euthanasia by injecting the drug into their body. Whereas in physician-assisted suicide, the doctor just gives the patient maybe like a small thing of pills to swallow, and those pills will kill the patient. Right? So the patient dies at their own hand. The doctor just provides them with the kind of necessary resources to kill themselves. All right, so those are the three categories. As I said, passive euthanasia tends to be morally, something morally acceptable. Hardly anybody has a problem with that kind of euthanasia. It's worth wondering, does it matter whether or not the doctor directly causes the patient's death rather than just like takes them off life support? Is there any interesting moral difference between active and passive cases? Also, is there any interesting moral difference between active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide? Our society treats these as different. Active euthanasia not legal anywhere in the US. Physician-assisted suicide legal in only about a dozen US states. So the law treats these as different. But is there any interesting moral difference between them? All right, let's consider what utilitarianism and Kantianism have to say about the ethics of euthanasia. So if we apply utilitarian thinking to this discussion, we'll see that the utilitarian is going to emphasize the overall happiness and overall suffering in any particular case of euthanasia. So we have to take into consider not only the patient who's sick, not only their potential or likely happiness or suffering if they continue to live, but also the happiness and suffering of their family members. And so we're going to need to factor all of this into an equation that's going to tell us whether this is an okay thing to do or not. So if it's going to result in more overall happiness, less overall suffering, then euthanasia would be permissible in a case. If, however, it would mean that we cut a patient's life short and that they would be missing out on happiness that they would have experienced had we not taken their life early, then the utilitarian recommendation is going to be to not perform euthanasia on the patient. So just like in every other case where we apply utilitarianism, the specifics of the particular circumstances matter. Each circumstance is going to have its own flavor, so to speak, and there's going to be different factors to consider. But the main thing the utilitarian is going to care about is what's the impact on overall happiness? Does it go up or does it go down? Kant's theory, by contrast, says that euthanasia is perhaps something that's never morally permissible because it involves treating an individual person as something that's disposable. And we say like we can just take your life away because you're sick and there's no value to your life anymore because you're sick. That would be a kind of anti-Kantian view. Right? All persons are supposed to be respected. Human life is intrinsically valuable. So according to one kind of Kantian perspective, we should never perform euthanasia because that involves killing an innocent person, and innocent persons should never be killed, according to Kant's view. Another way of thinking about how Kant's theory would apply, though, is to focus on what Kant says about persons being sort of in control of their own destiny, right? They have their own autonomy. They should be free to make their own decisions, and they shouldn't be manipulated into doing something they don't want to do. So this other way of thinking about how Kant's theory would apply to euthanasia says roughly that if a patient is a person, if they're competent, coherent, and rational, then perhaps the choice is theirs to make. It's theirs to make. Maybe they'd be choosing wrongly if they decide to opt for euthanasia because they would be using themselves as a mere means rather than an end in themselves. But there is a kind of deep issue here for the Kantian to sort out. Is euthanasia in general morally permissible or is it not? If we're thinking about patients in a vegetative state, then the Kantian answer is fairly clear. If the patient is no longer a person, right, because they don't have the relevant mental abilities anymore to qualify as persons, right? They're not competent, coherent, or rational. Then performing euthanasia on them would be permissible because it wouldn't be killing an innocent person. Now, if, of course, they do have the mental abilities in place, still, even when they're in this kind of condition where they're temporarily not able to exercise those abilities, then euthanasia would be morally wrong because it would be killing an innocent person. All right, in these discussions about the ethics of euthanasia, just like when it comes to discussions about the ethics of abortion or the ethics of, owning a gun, the ethics of animal welfare, all the big questions that we're going to be wondering about in this class, it's important to distinguish between the moral question and then questions about what the law should say. So when it comes to euthanasia, the central moral question we're going to be asking in this chapter is active voluntary euthanasia morally permissible? So euthanasia where the doctor is the one that causes the patient to die and the patient has given voluntary consent. Is that an ethically permissible practice? The central legal question concerns what the government should or should not allow. Should there be a general law prohibiting active voluntary euthanasia? There is such a law currently in the U.S., but should there be one? Right? That's a question about what the law should say. So we have a moral question on the one hand, and then a kind of legal question on the other hand. And we're going to be focused mostly on the moral question. We'll say a little bit about some things that will be relevant to the legal question. We're first going to take a look at two arguments for active voluntary euthanasia, and then two arguments against it. The first two arguments for are going to appeal to two different kind of principles in ethics. One of them is called the right to self-determination, which roughly says you have a right to kind of be the driver in your life. You're the one that's in control of your life. Nobody else should be forcing you to do things that you don't want to do, taking courses of action you don't want to take. You should be free to decide how you're going to live your life. With certain restrictions, obviously, like, just because you might want to go around and do bad things to other people, steal from them, beat them up, whatever it is, it doesn't, the right to self-determination doesn't give you a right to do those things, but within reason. Like if you want to become a plumber as opposed to becoming a nurse, the choice is yours, right? Shouldn't be forced to do one thing or another. All right, so that's what the right to self-determination says. Then this other principle, the duty of beneficence, says that we have an obligation to help those in serious distress or peril. So imagine, for instance, that you're walking across Texas State's campus and you see a small child drowning in one of the ponds on campus. Nobody else is around, and you can save this child's life. All you have to do is reach your hand in and pull the child out. It's quite easy to do that. Don't you have an obligation to help this child? If you were to just walk on by and allow them to drown, you would be failing to do what you have a duty to do. Okay, so that's what the duty of beneficence says. The first two arguments for active voluntary euthanasia are going to appeal to these two different principles. I'm trying to draw the conclusion that active voluntary euthanasia is morally okay. We can combine the two principles that we just saw on the last slide into one overall argument for active voluntary euthanasia. So consider that competent persons have a right to self-determination. So they have a right to decide how the course of their life is going to go, what they're going to do in their life, as long as they're not violating the rights of other people. They're not actively harming other people, stealing other people's stuff, etc. They're just sort of keeping to themselves, doing whatever it is that they want to do. And so competent persons have that right. This is a free country after all. Now, suppose that I decide I want to be euthanized. Right? Now, who would I be harming if I do that? Which other person's right am I violating if I decide that I want to take my own life? I'm not violating anybody else's right. So it looks like exercising a right to euthanasia, if we had one, would be a legitimate use of the right to self-determination. Right? If I can decide how the course of my life is going to go, then doesn't that mean I should be in control over how I'm going to die? Right? We often talk about like the right to life in this country. If you have a right to life, doesn't that mean that you have a right to opt out of life? Right? Just like consider other rights, for instance. Like you have a right to vote means you can vote, but you don't have to. Right? Or a right to own a gun means you can own a gun, but you don't have to. Right? So wouldn't the same thing apply to the right to life? Right? You can live. Of course, you don't have to. It's like nobody should be forcing you to vote if you don't want to vote. Nobody should be forcing you to own a gun if you don't want to. Same thing goes for life, doesn't it? If you don't want to live, you shouldn't be forced to. Right? So given the right to self-determination, it seems that you would have a right to euthanasia, right to be euthanized. Now combine that right to self-determination with what we call the duty of beneficence, which says that other people have an obligation to help those who are in serious distress or peril. Now, if we're assuming that, say, I am in serious distress or peril, let's assume that I have some terminal illness that's causing me to suffer day in and day out, and I want to rid this suffering. I want to end my suffering, to ease my pain, and just end it. Doesn't that mean that if I exercise my right to euthanasia, other people are going to have to make good on their duty to help me when I'm in serious distress or peril? Now, quite naturally, who's this other person going to be? Well, a doctor. A doctor has at their disposal the sorts of drugs that you would use in a case of euthanasia to take the person's life. Right? So if I have a right to self-determination, that implies a right to die, a right to be euthanized. That implies a duty on the doctor to ease my suffering, to respect my choice, right? Because I'm the patient, I have autonomy in this case, I'm in control. The doctor would have this duty to then euthanize me. Okay? So active voluntary euthanasia for competent persons would therefore be morally permissible given the right to self-determination and this corresponding duty that the doctor would have to euthanize me in that case. Here are some critiques of that argument that we just looked at on the last slide. One critique is that modern medicine can relieve the pain of dying patients, so performing euthanasia on them would be, strictly speaking, unnecessary. Why take their life if we can just relieve their pain and then they can just die naturally? And so that's one critique. Another critique is that euthanizing a patient actually harms them because it deprives them of some possible happiness in their remaining few days if we don't take their life early. And to deprive somebody of future happiness is to do them wrong. And then a third critique of the argument is, well, if you euthanize a patient, you are eliminating the possibility of a miracle. Right? Even if somebody has a terminal illness and the doctors say that there's no hope for them, isn't there still a chance that a miracle could happen and they could be saved? Doesn't that sort of thing, although it's rare, doesn't it happen? Right? And shouldn't we give them some hope and allow them the possibility of surviving whatever it is seems to be killing them? Perhaps some of you are convinced by those critiques of the argument for active voluntary euthanasia. Maybe some of you found those critiques we just looked at kind of wanting. Right? So here are some responses to those critiques. So to respond to the critique, or one of them or all of them, would be to try to defend the argument for active voluntary euthanasia against those critiques or objections. All right, so one response to the first critique, which said that we can just treat people for their pain, and so active voluntary euthanasia is unnecessary. The response is, well, this relies on an overly optimistic view of pain management. Right? Go to a hospice, for instance, and see what happens on a day-to-day basis in terms of pain being treated. Right? So for some people, you can treat their pain with, highly potent pain medications like morphine or Dilaudid, things like that. But some people have physical pain that's so bad that you can't give them enough pain medication to eliminate their pain. Or for other patients, the suffering is psychological. It's not physical suffering in their knee or their shoulder, for instance. It's psychological, and you can't use pain medication to relieve that kind of suffering. Right? And sometimes people decide they want to be euthanized because their psychological suffering is so bad. All right, so the first critique you might think fails for that reason. It relies on this kind of overly optimistic view of pain management. Another response to the critiques we just looked at is that not all killing is wrong. So to think that euthanasia involves unjustified killing is to kind of just assume that euthanasia is morally unjustified. It's not really like an argument against the moral permissibility of euthanasia. At the very least, not a legitimate critique of the argument based on the right to self-determination and the duty of beneficence that we looked at. All right, another response to critiques. Isn't it cruel to support something like passive euthanasia without also supporting active euthanasia? When active euthanasia can eliminate future suffering? Right? Like, why think it's okay to let somebody die of natural causes when that means that's going to put them through lots of suffering, when you could just give them the drugs to help them just die in peace more quickly and avoid all of that unnecessary suffering? By analogy, we tend to think that this is totally okay to do in the case of animals. When you have a sick animal, it's viewed as an act of mercy to put the animal down rather than have it suffer. So shouldn't we also think that in the case of human beings, it would be an act of mercy to extend euthanasia to a patient rather than force them to suffer? And then the last response to the critiques is, pointing at this idea that we should let, a miracle possibly happen. The response to the critique is, well, okay, so we can say that the miracle might happen, but is that possibility ever relevant to making a rational decision about what to do with a patient or what to do with one's own life? If you are in the driver's seat deciding whether or not you'd like to be euthanized. What does the possibility of a miracle actually do for us? Is it relevant at all? Well, it looks like it's not really relevant because, yeah, of course, a miracle could happen. But, suppose I opt for euthanasia and the doctor tries to kill me, and then lo and behold, a miracle happens, right? The drugs don't kill me. And so I end up surviving these drugs that were intended to euthanize me, and then I'm cured of my illness. That's also a possibility. So solely opting for euthanasia doesn't eliminate the possibility of a miracle at all. But the miracle could still happen. All right. And then, we might kind of think more broadly about the possibility of a miracle in any other case. I mean, just think about like somebody saying, well, I'm going to reject being treated for my illness. Maybe it's just like, COVID or something like that. I'm going to reject being treated for it because a miracle might happen. I might just be cured, by the hand of God or something like that. Well, it's like, well, yeah, of course, that's possible. But, does that make it reasonable to reject the treatment for the illness that you have? Looks like, no, it doesn't. It's still the reasonable thing to do is to get the treatment, even if it's still possible that a miracle could cure you without the treatment. So why not say the same kind of thing in the case of euthanasia, right? Although it's possible that a miracle could happen, if you decide to not opt for euthanasia, that same miracle could still happen even if you opt for euthanasia. Here's another argument for active voluntary euthanasia. This one's totally distinct from the argument based on the right to self-determination and the duty of beneficence. So according to this argument, passive euthanasia is morally permissible. And if passive euthanasia is morally permissible, then active euthanasia is also morally permissible because the two things are morally equivalent, passive euthanasia and active euthanasia. Right? So again, we tend to treat these two categories, passive euthanasia and active euthanasia, different in the way we actually think about euthanasia. But is there any good reason to treat them differently? Right? So in other words, like the law treats them differently by making active euthanasia illegal in all 50 states, while passive euthanasia is totally fair game in all US states. And people tend to think that it's totally okay to turn off a ventilator on a dying patient when they request it. Some people are skeptical whether it's okay for a doctor to actively inject the drugs into a patient to kill them. But is there any good reason to think that these are two morally different categories? All right, some people say yes, active and passive euthanasia are clearly morally different because one involves killing a patient while the other involves merely letting the patient die of the natural causes, whatever is actually killing them. So there's a difference between killing and letting die. All right, now is that a morally relevant distinction? Here's a classic thought experiment in the history of ethics that tries to show there really is, at a fundamental level, no difference between killing and letting die in terms of the ethics of killing and letting die. Right? There might be a kind of difference at the level of like what's causing the person to die, but at the level of ethics, there is no ethical difference. All right, so here's the thought experiment. Suppose we have a man named Smith who is babysitting his 6-year-old cousin, and the 6-year-old cousin and Smith, they both have this grandfather who's sick and dying at the hospital, and he's got like millions of dollars in the bank, and he's going to leave all of his money equally split between Smith and the 6-year-old cousin when he dies. Right? But Smith doesn't want to share the money with the cousin, and so what Smith does is while he's babysitting the cousin, he murders this child so that he can get all of Grandpa's money when Grandpa dies in a few days. All right, so he stages the death as if it were a total accident to rid himself of any possibility of being blamed for this. And let's suppose he's like a mastermind at manipulating other people into thinking this was an accidental death, and he gets off like scot-free. Right? So although he kills a child, he ends up getting all of this money from Grandpa. Nobody finds out about it, and he's just sort of selfish anyways. So he's done what's in his own best interest. All right, now compare that case to the case of Jones, where Jones is in the same kind of situation, babysitting his 6-year-old cousin, and they happen to have a grandfather who's going to die in a few days and leave them both equally split amounts of money. And Jones also doesn't want to share the money with his 6-year-old cousin. All right, so Jones, while he's babysitting the cousin, walks into the bathroom while the child is taking a bath, and he's planning on murdering this child in the bathtub. But he notices that when he walks in, the child has slipped in the tub while he was washing himself and hit his head on the side of the tub and is drowning in the water. Right? So Jones could pull the child out and save the child's life, but he was intending to kill the child anyways. And he says, "Oh, now I don't even have to murder the child because the child's going to die on his own." Right? So Jones lets the child die, whereas Smith actively kills the child himself. All right, now, the crucial question for us, are these actions morally equivalent, or has Smith done something worse than Jones? And it seems quite plausible to think that they've done something equally bad. Right? Even though Jones didn't kill the child, Jones just let the child die, failed to save the child, Jones is still equally blameworthy for the death, and Jones is still, equally as bad of a person as Smith is, because they both like wanted the child dead, the relevant children in each of their cases. They wanted the child dead. They both intended to murder a child. Smith actually did it. Jones was about to do it, but then noticed he didn't have to. But that doesn't seem to make his action of failing to save the child, his action of letting the child die, any morally better than the action that Smith took. Right? So the main point here is that in principle, there is no moral difference between killing and letting die. They're, morally speaking, on a par with one another. Right? So if that's right, then it looks like in the case of active versus passive euthanasia, there's really no reason to think that there's any deep ethical difference between pulling a plug on someone who gives consent and then having a doctor actively cause a patient's death by injecting them with enough drugs to kill them when the patient has given their consent. Okay, so we've looked at 2 arguments for active voluntary euthanasia. What about a couple arguments against euthanasia? One main argument against euthanasia is what's called the slippery slope argument. There's a general worry behind this argument about what would happen if there was a kind of general societal acceptance of euthanasia. If we accepted euthanasia as a society, wouldn't there be more and more cases of people dying prematurely? Maybe people opting for euthanasia when it's not really in their best interest. Like if we gave everyone a right to die, wouldn't we worry about, maybe some young people opting for euthanasia just because maybe they're temporarily depressed or suffering from some kind of temporary mental illness that maybe can be treated with medication or with therapy or something like that? Wouldn't there be lots of cases of people taking their own lives or opting for euthanasia, having a doctor take their life, but they're giving consent prematurely? And isn't that something that we shouldn't want in society? We should want people to flourish in society and people only ending their lives perhaps when there's good reason to think that there's no hope for them. Right? So the worry here is that there would be a kind of widespread abuse of the practice if we generally accepted euthanasia in society. All right, so that's the slippery slope argument. Does the slippery slope argument succeed? Well, if it were true that there would be widespread abuses of a right to euthanasia, if such a right were granted, that would suggest that perhaps it's a bad idea to grant an individual right to euthanasia. Now, the most controversial point in the slippery slope argument is the second premise, the premise that says that there would be such widespread abuses. There's no good reason to think that there would be. In fact, you can look at countries that have legalized euthanasia around the world, and it's not like they have huge numbers of people euthanizing themselves when the doctors think that it's not a good idea for them to do that. Right? In fact, in the parts of the world where it is legal to be euthanized, there's a whole like checks and balances system. It's not like a same-day service thing where you can just walk into a minute clinic and be euthanized the same day. You have to like talk with your doctor on various occasions across the span of a few weeks. They have to evaluate you physically and psychologically and make sure this is really in your best interest. And you have to have a doctor sign off on your euthanasia form. Again, weeks in advance. So it's not like the sort of thing where if we did have a right to euthanasia, that we couldn't have any regulations on it or any system of checks and balances to try to reduce or possibly eliminate the kind of negative consequences that we think might arise if such a right were kind of written into law. All right, and then one final thing to say about the slippery slope argument. Isn't it the case that anytime you expand individual rights and freedoms, you're going to be left with some bad consequences? Okay? Like suppose we're thinking about a right to drive. Right? People can drive when they become adults in the US, and there are car crashes every year. Tens of thousands of people die because we have this right to drive. It's not like written anywhere into the Constitution that you have a right to drive. But of course, it's just this like implicit right that we think people have. You can of course, give up or be forced to give up your driver's license if you do bad things on the road. But if you don't do bad things on the road and you pass your driver's test, you can get a driver's license and you can drive. Same thing applies to other rights that we tend to grant people, like a right to drink alcohol when you're 21. People die of illnesses caused by drinking too much alcohol every year, right? So with respect to every kind of freedom that people have, it seems that there are going to be some bad consequences that result from it. Question for us, in the case of euthanasia, are these potential bad consequences so bad that they would kind of outweigh the societal benefit of having a legally protected right to die? All right, that slippery slope argument that we just looked at is probably the most popular argument against active voluntary euthanasia. There is another argument against euthanasia that is almost as popular, maybe not, but still has quite enough support behind it that it's worth thinking about. And that's an argument that's based on religious belief. Right? So some people think that euthanasia is wrong because it involves granting to an individual person a kind of free choice that they shouldn't have. Right? It's like the idea is that it's not your decision when you're going to die. It's God's decision. And if you decide to be euthanized, you are trying to take control over something that really is not in your power, shouldn't be in your power. Right? Because only God should decide when someone will die. Right? So that's a kind of appeal to religious idea. And not only can this idea be used to try and argue that euthanasia is wrong, it can also be used to try and support the idea that it should be illegal too. Right? So you can see that here in this argument, we have one conclusion on line 3, active euthanasia is morally wrong, and then in line 5 we have active euthanasia should be illegal because it's wrong. All right, so here are some worries with this argument, some critiques of the argument. First critique is that U.S. law should not be determined by any particular religious belief. Because, after all, we should have a society that protects religious freedom, and no individual person should be forced to have any religious belief that they don't want to. They should be free to decide which one they have, which one they don't have, whether to have any at all. And so we can't use the idea only God should decide when someone will die as a premise in an argument for what the law should say. All right, so that's kind of a worry with drawing the conclusion in line 5 from the first premise. Another possible critique of this argument is what reason is there to think that only God should decide when someone will die? Okay, so people sometimes say that, but what's the support for thinking that? Right? It's not like there's any text that we could point to, like any religious text we could point to and say, here's a quotation or passage that says only God should decide when people die. After all, if you look at many of the major world religions' central texts, you'll see that there are many passages where it says what you are required to do as a human is to kill this other person. Right? For various infractions, for instance, in the Old Testament, for instance, if a child swears against their parent, they are to be put to death. Right? And so that's a case where people are putting other people to death. Right? So that's just one passage. There are many other passages in the Old Testament where the requirement is to put people to death for committing certain crimes. Right? So that would suggest that it's not only God's decision when somebody dies, but it's actually a decision that humans can make too. All right. So there are some significant worries with this appeal to religious belief, and so the argument, on the whole, doesn't seem to be all that convincing. All right. So we are winding down to a close here in this chapter, but it's we've gone through 2 arguments for euthanasia, 2 arguments against it. It's worth thinking about the current American Medical Association's Code of Medical Ethics opinion on euthanasia. You can see here that it's a very negative opinion. I'm not going to read through the thing, but it takes a very negative stance on the euthanasia issue. Right? Doctors should not perform euthanasia on their parents and their patients, and there are various reasons cited as to why doctors shouldn't do this. Now, if the arguments that we've looked at in this chapter for active voluntary euthanasia are better than the arguments against active voluntary euthanasia, then presumably this code of medical ethics would need to be revised. After all, this is, a code written down by human beings, namely doctors, and, have doctors thought through these ethical arguments that we looked at in this chapter? Have they thought them through to the point where they can make an informed judgment about every possible patient's life and what would be best for them? Or should there be a kind of more relaxed attitude towards euthanasia where the Code of Medical Ethics says something like, maybe euthanasia is permissible in certain cases, namely when it reduces suffering. And the reasons cited in this opinion could still apply in the kind of revised opinion. Things like patient autonomy could still be respected. Doctors don't have to be viewed as abandoning their patients if they grant them a kind of right to euthanasia. They can still communicate with their patients, give them emotional support, comfort care, all sorts of stuff. All right, so the reason why we're just taking a look at this code of medical ethics opinion is that it shows the relevance of thinking through the arguments, the kinds of arguments that we've been looking at in this chapter, to a real code of ethics that influences how people practice their profession on a day-to-day basis. All right, so that's it for chapter 10.